Tonight we have Julie Chavez Rodriguez, the granddaughter of Cesar Chavez, and she's going to talk about the legacy of her grandfather and how it's influenced her to do all her work today. So please clap your hands for Julie Chavez Rodriguez.
Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to this evening's lecture. Hopefully this evening will be an opportunity to learn a little bit more about my grandfather as well as myself and some of the work that I've been involved in. So just to begin, I'm going to share with you all a bit of some photos about his history and his life, and also talk about why is that history relevant today. And then I hope to open it up for questions and answers, because that's actually my favorite part of these sessions. I'm not very big on lecturing, but we'll do my part as I need to. So if you all do have any questions, you could feel free to ask them during the lecture, or if you'd just like to wait till the end, we will have a Q&A portion for that. I wanted to first start off by thanking Bruce Berkowitz and Angelina Gutierrez. I would be hit over the head if I didn't thank the organizers of tonight's event, considering that my grandfather was a grassroots community organizer. So I just really want to, thank you all and all the volunteers and staff that helped to support you in your work for making not just this evening possible, but we also did a workshop earlier, and I had some amazing Shangri-La food, so I'm nice and full. So hopefully I won't fall asleep behind the podium during the next hour. But I'd like to begin my presentations actually starting with a poem that was written by my grandfather in the early days of the farm worker movement. And I'd like to start out with this poem because I think it gives us an opportunity to just sort of sit and reflect a little bit about who he was and really what some of the universal values and messages that he had to really share with us through his work in organizing farm workers. So if you all would just sit and listen to some of the words and sort of the vision that he helps to bring forward for us. And he starts with, show me the suffering of the most miserable, so I will know my people's plight. Free me to pray for others, for you are present in every person. Help me to take responsibility for my own life, so that I can be free at last. Grant me courage to serve others, for in service there is true life. Give me honesty and patience so that I can work with other workers. Bring forth song and celebration so that the spirit will be alive among us. Let the spirit flourish and grow so that we will never tire of the struggle. Let us remember those who have died for justice, for they have given us life. And help us love even those who hate us, so we can change the world. Now, I think that when we look back on history, we oftentimes see, quite ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary times. And I want to characterize it that way because I think too often we see it as the reverse. We think that the people, in our history books were somehow extraordinary and found themselves in ordinary times. And I think that, whether we're talking about my grandfather or Dolores Huerta, who co-founded the Farm Workers Union with him, or people like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King, people who made tremendous impacts and contributions to our society and to our country, too often, we see them as somehow, larger than life, or somehow, up on a pedestal. And not to say that they shouldn't be recognized and honored for those contributions, but these individuals were quite ordinary, just like you and me, and just like my grandfather. So I'd like to start out with a baby photo of my grandfather. In 1927, he was born on March 31st, and that day is now recognized as a state holiday here in California and in 9 other states. And I'd like to start out with this baby photo again to just bring us back to sort of the roots of who we are as people. All of us at one point were a baby, just like my grandfather, and now, we're here. And it's those life experiences, those mentors, those individuals who helped to contribute to our growth and development that have brought us to this point. And my grandfather, was no different than that. He was, he wasn't born a leader. It was really through his own personal education, because he was self-taught, and his action that began to really set him apart, I think, from others. Now, this is a photo of him in the 8th grade, and he only went up to school until the 8th grade because he was forced to leave school and to work full-time in the fields of California in order to help to support his family. See, like so many farm workers during that time, his father was injured on the job, and they were a family of 5, 6 kids, and they needed support in some way. And so my grandfather grew up working in the fields. He understood the conditions of farm work, not just as something that he saw, but really something that he lived through and experienced. So it was in 1962 that my grandfather, alongside a woman named Dolores Huerta, which is right there, and hundreds of farm workers, that decided to join this rallying cry of "Si se puede," and we've come to know the English translation quite well, yes we can, but who joined this rallying cry, "Si se puede," to really bring about changes in the conditions of farm workers and farm worker conditions. See, during that time in 1962, no one knew whether or not this small brown man would be successful in his organizing efforts. Not even him. But it was really through decades of struggle, of organizing, of really, fighting not just in the fields of California, but throughout the country, standing in front of supermarkets, engaging other people in this cause, that he began to, bring about change for farm workers and actually establish the first successful union in the history of this country for farm worker rights. And, during that time, he helped to achieve basic rights, things that I think sometimes we take for granted. Things like clean drinking water while they were working in the fields, like restrooms, a place to go to the bathroom, if you can imagine not having that at your work site. Basic medical coverage so that as farm workers got sick or many were injured using the short-handled hoe that was featured a couple of slides back, that they could actually go to the doctor, and they could have a way for supporting their family. But I think the most critical change that he helped to bring about wasn't really measured in the contracts that they established between, the farm workers union and the companies that they were organizing. The most important impact that he made was getting people to understand that the people that pick our food aren't just part of a production cycle, but that they're human beings who sweat, who sacrifice, who too often, whose literally their blood was on the food that was brought to our tables. See, for generations before him, many people saw farm workers as just a tool to get food into the grocery stores. As simple as that little short-handled hoe, that's oftentimes how farm workers were treated. But for him, he knew that they were human beings. He knew that they were his mother, his father, his sisters and brothers, his aunts and uncles and cousins, all of whom had this common experience that he talked about in the form of humiliation because of the way that they were treated. And so many people have come to regard my grandfather as a leader, whether it's a civil rights leader or a Latino leader. Some even, consider him kind of more of a community servant and a social entrepreneur because he thought about things differently. He thought about more than just organizing farm workers into a union. It was really about building a movement. But, my grandfather never saw himself as a leader, and this is actually something that I've shared with a few of you that I've had a chance to meet over the course of the day. He would always say, "I'm not a leader, I'm a union organizer. Organizers have to work hard and they have to be dedicated." And that's always how he saw himself and how he saw his life. Now, my grandfather was, able to not just bring together farm workers, but was really able to build a pretty diverse and pretty widespread coalition of people. One that I don't know if we've really seen replicated up until the more recent presidential elections. But he was able to pull together politicians like Robert Kennedy, who you see in this photo here, to come out to the small town of Delano, California, and actually hold a Senate subcommittee hearing to say, why are farm workers being treated as though we were living in the 19th century? Who was really able to use his authority and his position to call attention to these gross conditions. He was also able to mobilize and pull together students just like yourselves. You know, students from UC Berkeley, UCLA, from across the state would do donation drives and drive in van loads and truckloads down to the striking farm workers to bring them food and to bring them, you know, resources that they needed, because they were on strike for 5 years. If you can imagine having hope after even 1 year of this struggle to last through 5 years until they were able to experience victory. You know, the other groups that they were able to pull together too were folks from different religions who saw justice as a common theme for their own beliefs and their own spirituality. He also brought together folks from the environmental movement who saw the issue and impact that pesticides were having. You know, these early chemicals that were supposed to be this miracle of science were all of a sudden causing birth defects amongst farm workers, where farm worker children were being born without arms or legs or pieces of their spine missing, if you can imagine those. And lastly, you know, he helped to bring together consumers, people that just ate food every day. And when I talk to, you know, younger students, oftentimes I'll ask them what's seemingly a silly question, like, how many of you all eat food? And they kind of look at me like I'm crazy, and I'm like, it's okay, I am a little crazy, that's fine. But, you know, inevitably they all raise their hand, and it's just to make that simple point that each one of us every day of our lives benefit from the work of farm workers. You know, they may not be seen and heard every time we go to the grocery store, but I can imagine that day that, you know, we go into, whether it's a Safeway or Albertsons or Andronico's, and we see the image of the person who picked the grapes that you're about to buy, or who picked the lettuce. To me, that would be an amazing sight to see, to really, you know, honor the fact that we have human beings that bring food to our table every day. Now, you know, like most, the other point that I wanted to make in terms of the coalition is that it was also a very diverse coalition ethnically. You know, too often the face of a farm worker, and more so now than in 1962, is just a Mexican face. But in 1962, when my grandfather started organizing, and you see two of the individuals here, there was also a huge population of Filipino farm workers. And they were the first ones. They actually were the more courageous ones who decided to stand up first and ask the Mexican farm workers and my grandfather and Dolores Huerta if they would be willing to join their cause. And they ended up uniting in this, again, this new movement for farm workers. But there were also, you know, Caucasian farm workers who were left over from the Dust Bowl era, many of whom had to migrate from Oklahoma and other areas in search of work. There were African American farm workers. There were Arab farm workers. One of the first martyrs, a farm worker who was killed as a result of his union activity, was a brother by the name of Naji Daifala, who was an Arab brother. And so I think it's also important that we not change that part of history and assume that this was just, you know, one ethnic group coming together to begin to voice their opinions, but that it was actually people coming together from many different backgrounds to voice their opinion as farm workers in a united voice. And so, again, you know, against previously, you know, insurmountable, really, odds, my grandfather and Dolores Huerta and the countless farm workers were able to begin to change those conditions. But what was different about this movement was that it was also inspired by other courageous leaders who believed in nonviolence and who really demonstrated that by not using violence, we could bring about changes in our communities and in our country. And so my grandfather was a student, and I think it's important that we understand this. He was a student of Dr. King's. He was a student of Mahatma Gandhi's. You know, he read everything that he could get his hands on about not just those two individuals, but many others whose real example was one that he found inspiration and belief and motivation in. And so I think that, again, it's important that we understand how have the movements of the past inspired, the struggles of the future. And in that way, my grandfather was really saw the civil rights movement and Dr. King as such an incredible inspiration for his work and for the lives of farm workers. And it was really in 1968 when my grandfather was trying to figure out, how to take these issues from the town of Delano, California, out to the rest of the country, that he began to realize, the impact that a boycott could have. And it was, again, through looking at what was the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s for the civil rights movement. And he saw that, wow, it was an opportunity for people to be able to demonstrate that they cared about farm workers, even if they weren't living, in the Central Valley of California, or even if they'd never seen a farm or even worked on a farm in their life. That consumers everywhere, just by the fact that they ate food, could also be able to demonstrate their support. And so my grandfather decided to launch the Grape boycott, which, again, took farm workers from small towns, many of whom didn't speak English, many of whom didn't have any real money or support. Most of them were given a name, a contact person that they were supposed to call when they got to Philadelphia to say, this person's going to help you, and from that person you're going to be able to spread the word of the Great Boycott. So you can imagine the courage that it took from each one of those individuals willing to stand up, not just in the face of their employers, but to move across the country, to many of them leave their families, leave their communities, because they cared and believed so deeply in these issues. And so many people moved to areas like Chicago and Denver and Boston. I mean, I have the opportunity to travel quite a bit around the country, and no matter where I go, I find those folks that said, I boycotted grapes and I boycotted lettuce. And Cesar Chavez, I marched with Cesar Chavez, and he stayed at my house, and we had dinner. And so many amazing personal stories of the way that people weren't just moved by his words, but more importantly, they were moved by his actions, by what he did, and how he, really led by example and showed people the way. Now, the other important factor is that they believed deeply in the use of public policy. They had support from folks like Robert Kennedy at the national level, but it was also at the state and the local level that they knew they needed to bring about changes for farm workers. Because even till this day, in 2009, the only state that farm workers have the right to organize in is the state of California. They don't have the same rights as janitors, as grocery workers, as hotel workers. All of those classifications of workers were covered under the first legislation for workers, which was called the National Labor Relations Act. And it was passed in the 1930s. But farm workers were explicitly excluded from that act. And so till this day, 2009, they don't have the basic rights of other workers in this country. And that's something that I think is important for us to understand and to recognize. And oftentimes the question is, why is that? Well, in the 1930s, the Southern growers didn't want farm workers to have those basic rights. And they said, we won't sign your legislation unless you remove farm workers from that law. And that was the case, and it's lasted until today. And so the UFW was helpful in bringing about, the only legislation that actually protects farm workers here in the state of California, where other states have actually enacted laws even stronger against farm workers and their rights to organize. And so, to me, I think it's easy, it's a little bit easier to glorify the past, right? We're now in 2009, and so as we read through history books, we know that my grandfather and the Lotus Huerta were going to be successful. But during that time, when they decided to take that leap of faith, it was just that. It was a huge leap of faith. And they didn't know whether or not they were going to be successful. But, I think it's important that we understand how is it that they were able to kind of make those decisions, or why did, in particular, my grandfather choose to take on a life of basically self-imposed poverty and one of much sacrifice. He passed away when he was only 66 years old. And I think that says a lot about, what he had put himself through during those 66 years of life. Now, my grandmother, and there was a photo of her earlier. By the way, this is a photo of Chavez and Coretta Scott King, just to show a little bit of the solidarity that existed between the King family and the Chavez family. But, it was really my grandmother who was one of my grandfather's strongest supporters and his first and earliest supporters. She ended up going back to work in the fields along with my mother and my older aunts and uncles when my grandfather decided to start the union, because he didn't have a paycheck coming in. There was no organization for him to join. He was literally just driving, from community to community, knocking on doors. And so she and my older aunts and uncles, including my mother, decided that they were going to go back and work in the fields in order to support their family. And she knew that this was an important act for her, because she knew that his work wouldn't be possible unless she was really there to support him and to support their family. And it was shortly before he decided to join the union that he was actually offered a position within the Kennedy administration. And a lot of folks don't know this story, because it's one that hasn't been told too often. But he was asked to be the head of the Peace Corps in Latin America. And he decided, rather than he make the decision himself, that he was going to ask my aunts and uncles and my mother. And as the story goes, they all had a secret vote, because none of them wanted to have to actually vote. And all of them voted to stay and to start the union, except for my youngest uncle, Anthony Chavez. He said, "Heck no, man, I want to move to Latin America and live in a big house." But as history tells us, he was obviously outvoted. And so my grandfather had turned down, again, that position, because for him, founding the union wasn't just sort of a quick decision that he made. It wasn't something that he was even fully confident about. He had a lot of self-doubt, and he knew that it was such a huge leap of faith, and he wasn't sure whether or not he would succeed. But for him, he did it anyway, because he realized that he couldn't live another day in his life without at least trying. And to me, I think that that's a really important and powerful lesson, that although he was afraid to fail, he knew that he would be more afraid having not given it at least the chance or the opportunity. And so, through it all, he really learned, and I think taught each and every one of us, how commitment and sacrifice could really set you free as individuals and as people. He used to talk to us and would often talk about the trap that most of us sort of get caught in, that we tie ourselves to a job or to a position out of security, because we have to pay rent, we have to take care of our families. And not to say that that's not a good thing to do, but he realized that, oftentimes what his brothers and sisters, saw and what they were afraid to do, and what my grandmother's siblings were afraid to do, is that they were afraid to really experience that opportunity of not just being tied to this, field work for that job security. He said that, farm workers for generations had allowed their families to continue in this cycle of poverty. And he said that it was easier for us and for our family to try to escape poverty, to leave it rather than to change the conditions that we found ourselves and our families in. But we inherited the poverty from our fathers and from our fathers' fathers and from our grandfathers and their grandfathers. We had to stop someplace. And that was a decision that he made. So he quit his job. He had 8 children. They had $1,200 in savings. And he would usually take the younger kids and babysit them while he was traveling up and down, trying to talk to farm workers. And to just give you a taste of the sheer will and determination that it took to continue is that, there were weeks where he would knock on 100 doors and maybe one door would open. But that one door would carry him to the next week. And although he would get very discouraged, he knew again that my grandmother was there to support him and to provide him with what he saw as the strength to be able to continue on. Now, earlier I talked about his motto, si se puede, and as we've heard in English, yes we can. And that motto to me is really the timeless legacy that he leaves for each one of our benefit. We know that si se puede, yes we can, is inspiring a whole new generation of young people, of activists, of leaders, of organizers. And I think that it's important in understanding this legacy of si se puede that we also too come to understand that we are the keepers of this legacy. And it's what we choose to do with this legacy, how we choose to carry it on and to continue it in our own lives and in our own communities, that will really make the difference. That wherever we, are in service of others or give ourselves to something that's bigger than us, that we are affirming those simple words, si se puede, yes we can. And I think that it's important for each one of us to understand that we live in a time of much affluence and abundance. And we're beginning to see that shift a little bit. And so as we experience this economic pain and this crisis that's happening, and whether it's our campuses or our communities, or I think too often times even for some of our families, that we really look at the kind of sacrifice and commitment and real service that my grandfather helped to really champion in so many people. And I'm really excited about our current president. I don't know how many of you all are, but I think that some of you may share my enthusiasm. Excellent. I think that we are really moving into a new time. And in President Obama's inaugural address, he really talked about kind of a new vision for our country, not just in terms of this idea of change, but really this new vision for each and every one of us. And he said that what is required of us now is a new era of responsibility, a recognition on the part of every American that we have duties to ourselves, our nation, and the world. Duties that we don't grudgingly accept, but rather seize gladly. Firm in the knowledge that there is nothing so satisfying to the spirit, so defining of our character, than giving our all to a difficult task. And so I think that we can agree people throughout our history have given their all to difficult tasks time and time again, and that my grandfather is one of those people, one of many. Their love and care for humanity really helped to give them the courage that they needed to ensure that, in my grandfather's case, that farm workers were treated as human beings with dignity and respect, and for so many others that they too were given that opportunity to move from what too often had come to be seen as this second-class status in our country. And so I think that it's important that, as we look back and as we reflect and as we think about some of the lessons that my grandfather, helped to teach me and helped to teach, I think, thousands of others throughout our country, that it's important that we ask ourselves, what is it that we can do? How is it that during this difficult time, this time of economic hardship, this time of true need in our countries, what can we do to give back, to really answer that call for change and for action and for service that's sweeping across our country? And my grandfather said it, best when he said that we don't need perfect political systems, we need perfect participation. And that's really where we're at right now, is not expecting that some new system or even new leader, although we're really inspired by him, but not expecting that that's going to be it alone, but understanding what's our part. And so I think for me, it's really exciting, because what better time to act than now? What better time to be of service than now? And, many people kind of think about, ways to celebrate or recognize or pay tribute to my grandfather. And I think that, it's important that we understand that the greatest monument to him or tribute to him or honor of him isn't really found in statues or in street names or even in, other types of recognition. Although that's really important and it obviously creates a space in our communities for that, I think to me really the greatest monument to him is to be of service to others. He instilled this courage in his own people. And so I feel like it's our responsibility and opportunity to continue that. And so, again, as we think about the greatest monuments that we can leave for future generations, it's really to be of service, to help to rebuild our schools, to serve our local food banks, because we know that there's more need than ever today and less people being able to give. To help to extend a helping hand to a student that might be struggling here, or maybe mentor a freshman who's just trying to find their way on this campus. That's really honoring my grandfather and honoring his work. And we recently received a thank you letter from the First Lady, Michelle Obama. And we were really, proud of this fact, because it wasn't just a thank you to the Chavez Foundation, but really what it was a thank you to each and every one of you who are out there and being of service to your campuses, to your local communities, maybe even to your own families. And so I wanted to share with you all just a little piece of this letter, because it's so important, I think, this message of service and change that we're experiencing now. And so Michelle Obama wrote that an individual act of service is not an isolated event. Its cumulative effect can be a powerful force for change. If each of us makes time to serve our communities, we will combine to not only strengthen the fabric of our country, but also serve to bolster the very idea of America, that each of us has the ability to shape a better future for ourselves, our communities, and our country. And this was my experience. I didn't come to this place just by chance or just because my grandfather was Cesar Chavez. I had the opportunity to graduate from UC Berkeley, and I studied Latin American studies. And it was an amazing educational experience. And I learned a lot through my formal, classes at the university. I even had to take Portuguese, which I don't speak very well, so hopefully none of you all test my Portuguese skills. But I feel like the most important lessons that I really learned in my life were growing up in the farm worker movement and being involved in my, campus and local communities. And I do have some photos to share with you, I think. Oh, those are the marches. That's my mother. And that's me, one of them. But from these experiences, yeah, I haven't been able to clone myself, although that's the next test. No, but from these experiences and being able to, know my grandfather and see him and observe him, I learned that we only have one life to live, and that it's how we choose to use our lives that determines who we are as individuals and as a community. And that's a really powerful and awesome choice that we have, but we have to make that choice. I also learned what it means to sacrifice, to help other people by giving them my time and my energy, and by giving up some of the material things in life in order to do this kind of work. And I learned what it means to have courage, the trust to give yourself to others, and the determination to not be afraid, no matter how scary a situation may seem. And I learned what it means to give yourself to a cause that's bigger than any one person. And so today, as we, kind of sit and reflect a little bit about the history and some of the lessons learned, and really celebrate what I see as not just my grandfather, but all the great, I think, leaders and people who have made an impact on our country, who have really used their education, I think, to benefit the lives of others. I think it's also important that we take time to recognize each and every one of you as students for being where you are today, and for not just making it here, but hopefully the responsibility that you now carry forward, having given the opportunity that you have to be here. Now, over the next maybe 2, 3, for some of you, 4, 5, 6 years, you all will have the opportunity to dedicate yourselves to a variety of different causes, both here on campus and also in the community. And, that's a pretty exciting opportunity. Not only are students and youth at the forefront of national politics, because I'm sure as many of you all know, the youth vote this year last year was very significant in electing our new president. But youth are also working tirelessly, in the trenches of our educational system, that are working tirelessly in unions, that are working at colleges and universities to ensure that there's more diversity on campus, that are contributing to community-based media projects and other things that are happening through grassroots movements and through grassroots organizing. Many people are putting their lives on hold right now because they believe that we're at a very unique and significant point in the history of our country. And I agree. It makes me so proud when I come into contact with folks who have voted for the first time, who have tutored a younger student for the first time, who have actually, gone out and used their media skills that they're learning in college to mentor a younger student who cares about film and media. And so for me, it's sort of a really exciting time to begin to see how can we take this message of Si se puede, yes we can, take this message of hope and change, and not just be satisfied with the fact that we've elected a new president, but really bring it back to our schools and to our communities. We can begin to compare our lives to a stone that gets thrown into a river. And, for those of you that have ever done it, you see that there are ripples that grow, right? The ripple effect, if any of you all have heard about that or thought about it. And to me, those ripples are really the tens of thousands of people whose lives are being impacted because of that one action. My grandfather decided that he was going to stand up and fight back. And it was through that action that so much more has begun to change in the lives of farm workers. And so we have that opportunity to also be of service. And there was a quote that was up here, not those, that I wanted to share with you all, that to me really, epitomizes that ripple effect. And he said that once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. And you cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. So if there are any lessons that we can learn from the last 50 years of our history, it's that we don't have to be afraid anymore, to stand up, to make our voices heard, and to ensure that people are treated with justice, respect, and dignity that they deserve. And so, if there's anything that you remember from our conversation today, it's the simple message of Si se puede, yes we can, to get involved and to stay involved in your communities. Each of you all have made it through these doors of opportunity, and so it's our responsibility to not just keep those doors open, but to hopefully take them off the hinges for generations to come. We've seen that together, Si se puede, yes we can. Thank you all very much. And I'll open it up for question and answers now. I don't have my, usually I have my cell phone on my hip and it's in my bag. So I don't know what time it is or how much time we have, but. What? 8:14. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers if you all would like to stay and join me. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Cvl, and I work with Migrant Education here in our area, and proud to work with a lot of students that are, like you said, in the trenches, mentoring and advising up and coming. My question is, what's your opinion, because I'm sure you thought of it, as to why the particular ethnic group, even though we were all brothers and sisters back in the day, and are still hopefully working that way, why is it that in terms of Latinos, you feel there has not been an increase in those that are achieving the higher education, despite the power of this coalition building, and it's a trickle effect that's happening, and there's so much more that needs to happen. What do you think is the reason, or what do you think we need to do?
Well, I mean, I think that even though we've made tremendous amount of advancements over the years, I think that there's still a lot that many of us can agree needs to be fixed, and a lot that's still broken, both in our educational system and in other areas. I mean, the question as to why, what is some of the challenges around Latino students, I think that there unfortunately continues to be a gross underfunding of public education. And when we look at, well, who are in our public schools, they're mostly students of color. And these public schools are not being funded or supported in the ways that they could be. And so that's why we begin to see the gross dropout statistics that we see, that 50% of our kids are, what I like to say is being pushed out of school rather than dropping out, because so many of them don't have the academic or social support to be able to be successful in our schooling. The statistic that always stays with me and that I think is really powerful is that every 29 seconds, a kid leaves school. Every 29 seconds in our country, just in the US, a kid leaves school. Now, if we think about, all these, or what oftentimes, folks want to create is all these issues happening in our communities. Well, how do we deal with gangs, and how do we deal with teen pregnancy, and how do we deal with, suicide, or the fact that kids are becoming cutters now, and there's so many more, issues happening with our students, but yet we don't want to fund education or after-school programs or youth development programs. I mean, that's the reason why I'm here. I'm a product of that. I wouldn't be here without the week-long leadership camp that I got to go to as, going into my freshman year of high school. That helped me transition a little bit better because I was scared as hell, like so many of our kids are, It was because of the support that, I had academically that I was able to achieve. And those programs are being cut, and they're being defunded. Right now our state is in a horrible budget crisis, and what are the first things on the table? Social services and education. Things that we know are necessary to build the human capital that this state needs to have a functioning economy. And so it's like, we continue to cut off our nose, to spite our face. It just does not make sense to me. And so I think that it's an issue of priority and political will. I work in a nonprofit organization, and so we talk about how do you prioritize something? You put time and resources to it. And what's being prioritized here in our state? Too often the building of more prisons, I mean, do you all know that they actually decide the prison beds based on the third grade literacy rates? So they know by third grade whether or not you are more likely to go to college or you're more likely to go to prison. If we know that, you think we wouldn't invest more in tutoring for third graders so that they could be they could be at grade level by the time they go on? I mean, when you think about it, and I work a lot in education, and so I'm kind of pulling from some of the research and info that I know, but when you think about your own schooling, you're learning to read up until the third grade. Once you hit the third grade, you have to read to learn. So if you can't read at the third grade, how are you expected to continue to achieve and to learn when that's the basic fundamental foundation for now education? And so, I think that, these are some important things that as, students who are potential teachers, for students that are potential lawyers, for students that, are potential doctors, whatever arena you go into, I think it's important that we know what some of these just basic, I think, injustices are in our communities. Because even if it's just making sure that, your kids, if you choose to have a family, know these issues and are willing to fight against the odds, Or if you choose a career in public service, that you understand that, that there are real issues that are affecting people's daily lives, that these aren't numbers, these aren't statistics, these aren't just, things that really don't have any significance. No, these are people. And so if we're not graduating them, I mean, they're a much bigger drain on our economy than if they were to graduate. And that's the other backward thing, You would think that there'd be a basic understanding, business understanding, that there's a bigger return on investment if we invest in education. Somehow someone missed that business course at our state level. You're welcome. Yeah.
You talked about the conditions of farm workers today in California and the rest of the states.
Definitely, and that's a really important point. And I also just wanted to thank you for your work with migrant students. I saw the art display. If any of you all get a chance to go into, and I'm going to butcher the name of the center, but it's the Center for, someone help me out here.
Center for Gender.
Yeah, sexuality and culture, I think. It's in the student union, but they have a beautiful art display up, and it's of student artwork, migrant student artwork, that's displayed throughout, and it's the most powerful stuff that you would see. And the reason why I brought that up, one, was to just honor you and thank you for your work, but also to share with you all what caught my attention this afternoon as I was looking at it. There's a series of crosses that were done for Dia de los Muertos that depict really powerful messages from these students. And one of them was actually dedicated to a farm worker that died last year. And she didn't die, she died on the job. And she didn't die because she was injured. She didn't die because, I guess the fact is that she died because she didn't get water. It's 2008 last year. I sit up here and I always have my nice bottle of water, and every time that I take a sip, I can't help but think, those that are denied that basic right. She was 17 years old. She was working in the fields at record high temperatures, and she complained to the foreman, her boss, that she wasn't feeling well, and then proceeded to kind of lose consciousness. And the foreman, in his negligence, said, go sit under a shady grapevine, which the temperatures under grapevines, because of the way that they're structured, are sometimes hotter than just out in the open sun. She wasn't given water. She was given kind of a wet rag, and they used it to revive her a little bit. They then proceeded to put her in a hot van and drove her to the liquor store first to try to get her some water to revive her and to put a little ice on her body because they thought that would help to cool her down. By the time they got her to the hospital, her body temperature had reached something like 110 degrees inside. And she died shortly after. They found out that she was 3 months pregnant. And so, this is a horrifying story. And I don't tell it to you all to, to do anything but to share with you all the lack of humanity, the lack of basic common sense sometimes, and to really think about, why? What allows a 17-year-old young woman to die of dehydration in 2008? And that's unfortunately the reality. Her name was Maria Isabel Vasquez Jimenez. And she was among 6 others that died last year. And the state even has emergency heat legislation that mandates the owners of companies to give their workers extra breaks and extra water during extreme high temperatures. And that was passed the year prior because 5 other farm workers had died in the fields. And so these are the conditions that still persist. And I think that it's important that, obviously folks like Chavez and Dolores Huerta helped to make changes. They got workers the right to organize. They got rid of the short-handled hoe that you saw there that was causing so many back injuries and so much disability amongst farm workers. They were able to get basic medical coverage and pension programs. But you know what? They weren't able to save Maria Isabel's life. And that's because there's still, a lack of basic humanity involved in some of our, agricultural production areas. And that's not to say that all of them are like that, because the UFW has been able to form partnerships with some companies. Now, unfortunately, it's usually the bottom line, what they're going to make, how they're going to profit, that's ultimately the deciding factor. And you know what? In order to save someone's life, that's fine if they care about the bottom line, because we know what we care about, We care about the people that are working in the fields and picking our food. So that's obviously one extreme, issue of conditions of farm workers, but conditions are still really bad. 80% of farm workers are undocumented right now. And so the issue of immigration is very real for farm workers and for them to be able to exercise their rights as full citizens. And so these are, issues that the United Farm Workers continues to work against. They actually held a press conference when they were trying to pass the emergency heat legislation. They held a press conference outside of one of the agricultural fields where there wasn't hardly any shade. And they made the legislators and the camera crews stand out there for 3 hours just to give them a little taste of what those conditions are like working under the hot sun. And sure enough, after an hour, folks were darting, trying to find shade. But it's just to get us to understand, Those are really difficult conditions. Yeah.
How can we not have fear when everything seems corrupt? I mean, I have hope in some regard that things will get better, but how can me, as living my daily life, not think about these things and not be afraid to keep, not living, but just keep consuming the produce or the fruit in the field?
Yeah.
How can we...
Well, I think, there are a few ways. One way is looking at, how you choose to spend, your dollar and being as informed as possible as a consumer about your buying choices. Earlier, I talked about the power of the boycott, and there's actually this great audio clip that I've heard my grandfather talking about the boycott, and he said, a boycott is so powerful because it's almost like voting. Except the difference between a boycott and voting is that in a boycott, the polls never close and you can vote as many times as you want. And so when we think about our purchasing power in that way, how we choose to spend our dollar is really important. Now, I would love, if we had the ability to buy everything, all of our produce that was under UFW contract, to know that, the workers were treated justly. Unfortunately, that's not reality, but on their website at ufw.org, there is a list of those companies that are under contract. So I would definitely say going out and supporting those companies. One of them is Swanton Berry. They serve strawberries, and they're an organic grower out of Santa Cruz, so they're also local. Others are folks like Monterey Mushrooms. You see that brand and that label a lot in stores. And so making a conscious decision, I think, to support those companies that are doing good, and then making a conscious decision to support those companies that aren't treating their workers fairly. And there have been a couple. One, and I hate to put a damper on the situation, guys, because I was in college once, but Two Buck Chuck was actually, they were the owner of they were buying grapes from the field where Maria Isabel died. And when they were asked as a company to actually require that they had higher standards for the grapes that they were buying, they said, it's not my problem. That's an issue. I understand it's cheap wine. Franzia is also cheap. It's in a box. You can get it. I would recommend not buying Two Buck Chuck or Charles Shaw, for those of you that don't know the shorthand version. But that's what I would recommend. And it's not always possible, and I understand, but the more informed decisions that you all can make as consumers, the more you could really exercise, your power and really begin to bring about that change. And it may seem like a small step, but I'll tell you what, If there were 17 million Americans across the country that were boycotting grapes in the 1970s, I'll bet you that 17 million people supporting good products can make a hell of a lot of difference. Yeah.
What do you think that we can do in terms of changing social discourse and at like a high school level in order to get people more equally distributing the rights of education? Just because I feel like one of the few things that was available to me in my high school was like building bridges, and if anything, it reinforced our differences more than it made alliances across the cultures. And I'm just wondering what you think needs to change in terms of that specific use of language to open up the minds to people more about that.
I mean, I think that there do need to be more intentional efforts around kind of that solidarity work. I mean, I think if we just assume that it's going to happen on its own, then, you know, I think then we've kind of failed that, you know, our high school youth or that generation of young people. And so, I mean, even if it's a matter of being able to kind of start with a mentoring relationship for one of those students, or even, you know, being willing to kind of be an advisor for a small group of young people that want to start doing those activities. Because, I mean, we work with high school youth in different areas of the country, and I'll tell you what, so many of them are really looking for that opportunity to be involved, to give back, to have that sense of community that could really offer. I think too many of the students on our campuses have become isolated, isolated from, you know, their peers, isolated from their families, and that, you know, we see the impact that lack of engagement has. You know, not only does it result in folks leaving school systems, but it also, you know, results in a variety of different kinds of abuse, whether it's drug abuse or you know, other kinds of abuse. The impact too, I think of, and I mentioned this earlier, like I've become very concerned at the social emotional issues on our school campuses that we are turning a complete blind eye to. You know, schools aren't equipped to deal with them, and they're under-resourced and underfunded, so this isn't to put the blame or the burden on the school, but they need to be addressed somewhere. You know, I've heard, as we work with young people, they talk about this new crew of kids that are referred to as emos. And I was like, well, what does emo mean? They were like, oh, they're the emotionally disturbed ones. And that's now like, you know, when I was at school, we had the skaters and the stoners and the preps and like, you know, these little crew. Now we have the emos. You know, that's become a way of a group not just self-identifying, but then also socially identifying. And that's, you know, and the fact that that's known and no one's creating an opportunity for intervention, you know, for conversation. It's just, to me, it's again, you know, I think that as adults, we need to begin to recognize the areas that we failed in, and to really say that, hey, you know, it's not these young people that are the problem. We've failed so many of them. What do we need to do? How can we step up to be able to be that support? Is there one final question before we close this evening? Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Diamante. If there is an advice you could give to Sonoma State students, Latino community, you know, here at Sonoma State, what would that be?
If there wasn't a Latino?
An advice, yes. An advice to Latino communities.
Oh, any advice to them?
Yes.
I mean, I think to me, sort of the best advice that I can offer to anyone is really that, you know, again, kind of that concept or that notion of si se puede, because I think that, you know, whether it's today or next week in finals, or, you know, next year as we're searching out our major or making sure we get those classes, I mean, no matter what, time and time again, there are seemingly obstacles or barriers to what we want to do and what we want to accomplish. And, you know, I think too often we've allowed those barriers to keep us from really reaching our full potential. And so I think not only is it important for you all as students here on campus, but also, especially again for the younger generations, to get them to see that that sometimes there are false barriers, or maybe even some real barriers, but you know what? We've broken through them time and time again, and that's something that we need to continue to do until those barriers are gone. And that, you know, that's going to take some work. Like, my grandfather never imagined that in his lifetime he was going to see all of the accomplishments that he wanted to see. And so I think that that's, again, that opportunity for us to continue that legacy, and to really, find those opportunities to really, to not just kind of say si puede, but to really demonstrate it, to be the role models, to really lead by example in that way. Yeah.
This quick question. What's the last thing that you recall your grandfather telling you before he passed, or something that made an impact that really kind of meant a lot to you?
Well, it wasn't right before he passed, but it was something that I sort of came to me shortly after he passed, and it was actually when I was 10 years old. It was 1988, and he had started his last and final fast, where he didn't eat for 36 days. And being 10 years old, I didn't fully understand what was happening and why it was that he had made this choice, and I saw him grow weaker every day, and basically what I had thought, was being on his deathbed. And during that summer, my sister and two of my cousins and we stayed with him, and my sister was in charge of bringing him water, literally to make sure that he didn't die, because the doctors advised us that he had to have so much water every day, and that would really jeopardize him. And even to the point where, my sister had to force feed him water because he was so sick of it, but we just knew the impact. So one day we were in Fresno, California, and Fresno wasn't very sympathetic then to the farm worker movement. And I was leafleting, and I passed out a leaflet, and this woman looked at me and she said, "I hope he dies this time." And I just looked at her, and she had no idea who I was. To her, I was some little snot-nosed kid, standing, probably she thought getting paid to stand in front of a supermarket, And I didn't say anything. I just froze, and I was obviously so hurt, and just, it was almost like, it was sort of the deepest pain that I had ever felt before. I never said anything. She took off, and I never saw the woman again, but I was so upset, and I think I realized I was more upset at myself than I was even at her, because I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything. You always want that ultimate comeback, and I had nothing, I had absolutely nothing to say to this woman. So I was frustrated at myself, and I was kind of like, what could you have done differently, and what could you do next time? And so finally I went and talked to my grandfather about it, because I knew, it was something that I couldn't deal with, and I was struggling with, and I was so upset. And so I walked into his room, and he immediately knew that something was wrong. I wasn't very good at hiding my emotions. I don't think I am still now till this day, which is probably a good thing. But so I walked in, and I was kind of, kicking my feet a little bit and looking down, and he asked me what happened, and I told him, the story about this horrendous woman. And he said, "Mija, next time something like that happens to you, you look that person in the face and you say that, 'I'm sure that you're in his prayers too.'" And I was like, "No, but Tata, you don't understand." I was like, "She made me so angry and so hurt, and I wanted to kick and scream and pull her hair. I wanted to make her feel as horrible as she had made me feel." And he looked at me and he said, "Mija," he's like, "the problem is that she doesn't understand." He said, "She doesn't understand, why I'm fasting. And she doesn't understand why you're out in front of that supermarket. And really, she doesn't understand what the farm workers are going through every day." He said, "And by you going after her, by you attacking her, you think that's really going to help her understand our issues any better?" And, at the time I was 10 and I was still pissed, I'm like, this isn't the answer that I wanted. I wanted that comeback. But, it was later on in life that kind of experience came back to me, and I was like, wow. And it hit me that was really, that conversation with my grandfather was this deep conversation about nonviolence, about respect, about really, ways to really build a movement based on those principles, and not, one that was about, getting everybody to be on my side and believe what I wanted them to believe, or to feel what I had felt in that way. And so that was a really powerful lesson, and it's one that I share a lot of times, in particular with students, and it may not, especially for the younger ones, it may not resonate now, but my hope is that, as I had that aha moment, that someday it will. That, if we really want to be true to social change and to social justice, that we also have to, be willing to stand up and to fight back in a way that is really true to our values and our principles. And that's one thing that my grandfather did. So, thank you all very much.